Hi and welcome back. This video is the second video in my series about common comma rules used in college level writing. In the first video, we talked about comma rules for separating two independent clauses, separating a dependent clause from an independent clause that it precedes, avoiding comma splices, and avoiding fused sentences. If you forgot these rules or you haven't learned about them yet, go back and check out the first video. In this video, we're going to be talking about 4 other common comma rules that are important to know in academic writing. These 4 are serial commas, introductory phrase commas, dates, and letters. In the last video, we talked about word analysis too. Word analysis is breaking down words or groups of words into parts to help you better understand their meaning. Word analysis is a great way to learn more vocabulary and to improve your comprehension. And so let's do a little bit of word analysis of the word cereal. It is important to note that cereal is spelled S-E-R-I-A-L and not C-E-R-E-A-L. Cereal with an S and cereal with a C are actually what we call homophones. But even though they sound alike, they don't mean the same thing. Looking at the cereal with an S, what words does it look like? What words does it remind you of? The World Series? TV series? Serial killer? Maybe this podcast serial if you ever listened to it. All of those words are related to something that's happened multiple times and typically things that happen one after another. For example, the World Series baseball games are all championship baseball games between the same 2 teams, and these games happen in quick succession. A serial killer is someone who murders people habitually, not just doing it once, twice, or even 3 times. Now, how does the word serial apply to commas? Well, serial commas are commas used to separate multiple items in a series or items in a list. But how many commas should you use for these items? An easy trick to remember is that you're going to use 1 fewer comma than the number of items in the list, unless you have 2 items in the list. So 3 items in the series, you're going to have 2 commas. 6 items in the series, you'll have 5 commas. 400 items in the series, you'll have 399 commas. You get the idea. Let's take a look at an example together. Paul Roger Loeb indicates people need to speak up, participate more in their communities, and be aware of what is going on in the world. In this list, there are 3 items, so there are 2 commas. Now, there are some people who got into an argument about the necessity of the last comma, which is often called the Oxford comma. It's important to remember that there's not actually a question of right or wrong with this. It's not wrong to include that Oxford comma, and it's not wrong to exclude it. It all depends on the context. Many professors prefer the Oxford comma to be used because it decreases the chances of a reader becoming confused at a writer's unclear separation of those items in a list. The reader can also misread the list and put 2 items together as one when they're actually 2 separate items. So this can happen if we leave that last comma, that Oxford comma, out. However, there are circumstances where we choose to leave out the Oxford comma. In journalism especially, it's a common practice to omit that Oxford comma. But why? Journalists want their articles to use less punctuation whenever possible because that punctuation takes up space. Printed newspapers only have so much space. And now that much news is online, it's also important to keep the article short to keep readers interested in it. You don't want to have too much in there. You may also choose to leave out that Oxford comma in notes and PowerPoint presentations. In notes and PowerPoints, you may use little to no punctuation just to keep things short and to the point, just as journalists do. But in these mediums, you can use more shorthand than journalists can. You might leave out periods and shorten words too. All right, so that's the serial comma. Next, we're going to talk about that introductory phrase comma. Some people call this the introductory element comma. It's a common comma, but it can be a little bit difficult to understand. So let's go back a little bit to that word analysis. If it's introductory, this means that it's at the beginning. It starts the sentence. So when you use a word or phrase at the beginning of the sentence that is not part of the first clause in the sentence, you need to use a comma to separate that phrase from the rest of the sentence. Often the introductory phrase is not part of the first clause of the sentence because it is a transition to help connect this sentence with the one before it. However, an introductory phrase does not have to be a transition. We also have prepositional phrases commonly used at the beginning of sentences to give the sentence a context of time and or place. The introductory phrase comma can be difficult to understand just from talking about it. We really need to look at a few examples to understand this particular comma rule. With that being said, Loeb fails to convince enough people to take action. For this example, with that being said, is a transition phrase, so it needs a comma to follow it. It's different than the rest of the sentence. It sounds different, so it needs to be set off from the rest of the sentence. It doesn't sound like it's quite part of everything else in the sentence. Let's take a look at another example of that introductory phrase comma. By the end of the excerpt, Loeb has built his credibility and appealed to his reader's sense of ethos. By the end of the excerpt is a prepositional phrase that is also an introductory phrase, so it needs a comma to separate it from the rest of the sentence. Okay, one more example of the introductory phrase comma rule. To improve his argument, Loeb needs to provide his readers with more specific examples of how to take action. To improve his argument is an introductory phrase that is separate from the rest of the sentence in a way, so it needs a comma to come after it to separate it from the rest of the sentence. So those are some of the examples of what I call the introductory phrase comma. Let's move on to the next type of comma, the date comma. This comma is for when we're going to write out the date in what I call the American format, with the month first, then the day second, and the year third. We need commas to separate the day and the year. For example, if we were to write out February 22nd, 2019, there would need to be a comma between 22nd and 2019. That comma gives a break between two sets of numbers and helps readers understand that 22 and 2019 are not one long number, but two sets of numbers. The date comma rule is similar to the rule for putting commas in between parts of an address, actually. So for instance, if the address is 2203 South 39th Street, St. Louis, Missouri 63110, there needs to be a comma between 2203 South 39th Street, the address, and St. Louis, the city. Also, there needs to be a comma between St. Louis, the city, and Mo, the state. You will notice that I said the date comma needs to be used when we write out the date in the American format. When we use the date in the format that the majority of the world uses, which is day first, month second, year third, we do not need to use the date comma because we don't have two sets of numbers back to back. The two sets of numbers are actually separated by the month in the middle. Remember, we're talking about writing out the full date and not abbreviating the date either, okay? When we abbreviate the date, it requires a different set of punctuation that we're not going to discuss in this video. So when we're writing out the full date and we're writing it in the American format, we need those commas. Our last comma rule for this video is for writing letters. I like to talk about the letter comma rules because the date comma rule is often used inside letters. The letter comma rule and the date comma rule often go hand in hand. They go together. You may be thinking that we don't often handwrite letters in this day and age, and you'd be correct. We tend to use a lot of other forms of communication, such as texting, instant messaging, and sending emails to communicate with people instead of writing letters. However, you may find yourself having to write a formal letter for work or for applying for jobs. It is very common for employers to request a potential employee to include what we call cover letters as part of their job application. Also, portfolios typically require a formal cover letter, so it's important to know when to use commas in letters and when to use punctuation for those cover letters for portfolios and for job applications. All letters should have what we call a salutation. This is how you're going to address the person you are writing. For example, Dear James, or To Whom It May Concern, are salutations. They are the start of the content of a letter. In informal letters and emails, the salutation should be followed by a comma. However, in formal letters and emails, the salutation should be followed by a colon, not a comma. That's the 2 dots. The other part of letters that need a comma is called the closing. The closing is how you're going to signal that the letter or email is ending and who has sent the letter. You sign or type your name after the closing. For closings, it does not matter whether your letter is formal or informal, you're always going to follow the closing with a comma. Sincerely is a very common closing for informal and formal letters that must be followed with a comma. Yours truly can be used for informal letters and emails and must also be followed with a comma. So in the last video, we talked about how correct comma usage builds your credibility. When you're applying for a job, one of the main things you're trying to do is to prove that you are credible. You're trying to prove that you have the knowledge and experience and would bring a lot to the job. Correct comma usage may not get you the job, but it can contribute to your overall credibility and increase the likelihood of you getting the job. Strong writing skills also demonstrate that you're a good communicator, and good communicators are useful and easier to work with. That'll kind of help you get the job. Lastly, I want to point out that there's one comma rule I don't cover in this video or in the part 1 video that's still an important comma rule. It is for introducing quotations. The reason why I chose not to include this comma rule in either this video or the other video is because I plan to talk about this comma rule in another video about introducing those quotations and formatting quotations in MLA. So look out for that video in the future. All right, that's the end of this video and the end of the 2-part series about correct comma usage. Go and check your writing to see if you've got any commas that aren't in the correct place, or maybe you're missing some commas. You need to add some commas. Maybe you need to add in a fanboy. Refer back to this video as often as you need to refresh yourself on those comma rules. Is there anything I missed about the last 4 comma rules or have questions? Add these in the comments below or contact me. Until next time.